Canadians are making a mass exodus, and now businesses on our Gulf Coast saying they are feeling the impact.
This comes as the U.S. clamps down on Canadians visiting, requiring background checks and fingerprints if they plan to stay more than 30 days in Florida.
Well, two for sale signs south of the border now in what is increasingly becoming a trend amid growing political tensions and economic uncertainty. Some Canadian snowbirds are packing up and saying goodbye to their U.S. homes for good.
Snowbirds are flying north. According to a South Florida real estate agent, Canadians are flocking out of the state.
Florida thought it could push Canadians around, but instead, it blew up its own economy. For decades, Canadian snowbirds pumped billions into Florida every single winter, keeping restaurants alive, hospitals running, and entire counties afloat. But one political miscalculation flipped everything upside down, triggering one of the fastest tourism collapses America has ever seen. And once Canadians walked away, they never looked back. For years, Florida had what most states could only dream of: a reliable cash cow that returned like clockwork every winter. These weren't your average tourists flying in for a quick week at Disney. No, we're talking about Canadian retirees, known as snowbirds, who practically lived in Florida for half the year. The numbers are jaw-dropping. Canadians spent $6.6 billion every year in Florida. And it wasn't pocket change. Each household averaged over $33,000 every single winter. They weren't staying in hotels for a few days. They were renting or owning homes, eating at the same restaurants, hiring contractors, and even scheduling surgeries while in Florida. Entire communities depended on them. In Lee County, Canadians made up almost half of all winter retail spending. In Sarasota, hospitals scheduled 60% of elective surgeries around Canadian seasonal residents. From Naples to Jacksonville, snowbirds weren't just visitors. They were the backbone of the economy. But Florida politicians started to believe their own myth, that sunshine was enough to keep the Canadians coming forever. That arrogance would prove catastrophic. Transition. But politicians made one fatal mistake. Florida's leaders assumed Canadians needed the warm beaches more than Florida needed their money. And that's when the first cracks appeared. The state introduced new bureaucratic barriers: background checks, fingerprinting, and extra registrations for anyone staying longer than 30 days. The exact group that had been fueling Florida's economy for decades suddenly found themselves treated like potential criminals. Imagine owning a condo in Florida for 20 years, faithfully paying property taxes, volunteering in local hospitals, and then being told you now need to prove you're not a threat just to spend the winter there. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult. Transition. And that's when the quiet exodus began. At first, the shift seemed small. A few cancellations, some homes quietly listed for sale, early departures back to Toronto or Vancouver. But soon, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Canadian rental bookings dropped by 31%. Airline reservations from Canada collapsed by 38%. Searches for Florida properties by Canadian buyers fell by nearly half. But the biggest blow? Property taxes. Canadians who had faithfully maintained Florida homes began selling off and walking away. In just 1 year, Florida lost over $2.1 billion in tax revenue from departing Canadians. This wasn't a vacation pause. This was a full-scale divorce. Transition. But the numbers only tell half the story. The human cost was even worse. Behind every statistic was a personal story of betrayal. Take Margaret Thompson, who had spent 18 winters in Sarasota. Every October she arrived, every March she returned to Canada. She spent over $40,000 in a single winter, on food, contractors, health care, you name it. But when fingerprinting became mandatory, she said it felt like being treated like a criminal. She packed up her condo, sold it, and swore never to return. Or the Chens from Vancouver. For 22 years, Florida was their retirement dream. But the hostile rhetoric from politicians was too much. They sold their Fort Myers home and never looked back. Helen Morrison owned a condo in Naples for 23 years. She knew the local grocery clerks by name, sat on the condo board, volunteered in hospitals. But one bad encounter at the fingerprinting office pushed her over the edge. She sold her condo at a $75,000 loss just to escape the stress. And then there were Jim and Carol Westbrook, who had bought a home in Clearwater specifically for health reasons. The warm climate helped with Carol's arthritis. But after being interrogated at the border about why they needed to stay for 4 months instead of 2, they too decided they were done. Entire communities dissolved. Canadian clubs lost 60% of their members. Churches shut down. Hockey leagues folded. Friend groups that had existed for decades simply vanished. Transition. And as the people left, so did the jobs. When Canadians left, it wasn't just condos sitting empty. Florida's service economy collapsed almost overnight. Restaurants that once relied on Canadians during the slow winter months suddenly had no customers. Supermarkets reported sales plunging by millions of dollars. Construction crews that specialized in snowbird properties saw contracts fall by 70%. Hospitals were gutted. Medical tourism from Canada dropped 60%. Doctors who had once built entire practices around Canadian patients had to fire staff, shut down wings, and, in some cases, close completely. Airports built entire terminals for Canadian charter flights. By 2025, those same terminals were ghost towns, with airlines slashing routes by nearly half. Even luxury industries collapsed. Canadian buyers had once accounted for 70% of multi-million-dollar home purchases in Florida. Without them, the luxury real estate market dried up almost overnight. Transition. But while Florida was falling apart, other countries were moving fast to grab their place. Mexico wasted no time. They rolled out the Amigos del Norte program, streamlined visas, tax incentives for property ownership, English-speaking services, and even partnerships with Canadian banks. Canadian retirees found the transition seamless. And the result? Canadian tourism in Mexico jumped by 78% in early 2025. Portugal offered something Florida couldn't: EU residency, world-class health care, and Mediterranean winters. Their Golden Visa program turned Canadian snowbirds into European residents, giving them culture and security Florida could no longer match. And the Caribbean nations coordinated like never before. Barbados, the Bahamas, and the Dominican Republic all launched programs specifically targeting Canadian retirees. They offered tax breaks, direct flights, and property incentives. Where Florida pushed Canadians away, these nations welcomed them with open arms. Transition. And back in Florida, leaders were still in denial. As tax revenues collapsed and hotels closed, Florida politicians doubled down. Publicly, they blamed global economic forces. Privately, they knew the truth, but refused to admit it. Governor Ron DeSantis, a name you've probably heard before, insisted Florida didn't need Canadians, claiming American tourists would fill the gap. But the math didn't add up. One Canadian household spending $33,000 over 6 months would take 28 American families on week-long vacations to replace. That kind of volume simply didn't exist. Industry leaders begged for change. Hotel owners, restaurant groups, hospital administrators, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. Politics came before economics, and Florida's leadership refused to reverse course. Transition. And here's why Florida may never recover. By 2025, it was clear the damage wasn't temporary. Canadians had already established new homes in Mexico, Portugal, and the Caribbean. Entire social networks, medical systems, and property markets had shifted away from Florida. Even if Florida rolled back its policies tomorrow, the Snowbirds wouldn't return. Why would they? They had already found new communities where they were respected, welcomed, and valued. Florida didn't just lose billions in revenue, it lost its reputation, it lost trust, and in the process, it lost the very soul of its winter economy. So, what do you think? Can Florida ever repair this broken relationship with Canadians? Or has the Sunshine State permanently destroyed its own tourism empire? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story isn't just about Florida. It's about how political choices can wipe out decades of economic prosperity in a single stroke.